Well, welcome everyone to this second day of the Sophia Conference of 2024. It is my pleasure right now to be introducing Luis Ribeiro, who is a historian of science and got his PhD in the history and philosophy of science at the University of Lisbon. His PhD thesis was published as a book by Brill under the title Jesuit Astrology, Prognostication and Science in Early Modern Culture. And I think maybe it's fair to say that you are one of the few, if not the only, person working on Jesuit astrology at this moment.
I suppose I am.
Yeah. So anything you want to know about the Jesuits practicing astrology, which might seem like a non sequitur right away, speak to Luis. He will tell you all about it. He also runs the Astra project on astrological techniques and practices, and he works also at the University of Lisbon. So it is my pleasure to introduce him now. He's going to be speaking, as you can see, on a science of correlations connecting the celestial and the earthly. So, welcome, Luis.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank you for being here, for the nice invitation that the Sophia Center did for me to be here speaking. So I'll be speaking today on the science of correlations. I wanted to keep my lecture within the topic of the conference, as above, so below. So this interconnectedness between what's above and what's below. So instead of focusing on one specific topic, I decided to do a sort of showcase of how correlations and connections between the celestial and the earthly are done throughout the history of astrology. So let's make a little tour. Okay, let me just see if I... Okay, so as above, so below. This is a premise that is foundational to astrology and to all that has to do with celestial divination and the attempt to understand how celestial events can impact our daily lives here on our material existence. And this connection has been made, explained by several concepts, which I here have assembled, I think, which are the main ones. So influence being one that has perdured for many centuries due to the natural philosophy and the causal Aristotelian explanation of astrology. But we also have symbol, which is something that keeps being fought over. Is a celestial event a symbol of something, or it is the cause of something? And this is a huge debate in theology and in natural philosophy. But you can see it also as a correlation, an echo, a radiation, which has to do with influencing, a mirroring of some sort, a correspondence, an analogy, or even a proportion or a geometry. It might be simply the result of nature's geometry. And things are as they are because they're geometrically or proportionally correlated, which is something, for example, Kepler explored. Not in a practical sense, but at least theoretically he did. Okay, and then we go to a word that is often used to explain astrology, symbolon, symbol, the origin of the word. And symbolon in the Greek culture means, among other things, a token that was broken as a contract or a promise of friendship between two people. So something that can be reconnected. And so as a part of a whole. So when we speak about symbols, we are also talking about the above and the below. So two halves of the same whole. So this is a very important connection also to this correlation structure. And correlation is important because if we want to understand astrology and not only the mindset, but the methodology and how it inserts and interacts with each specific culture in which astrology was practiced, we need to understand how these correlations, these symbols, these equivalences are being done by the mind of the astrologers. So let's start with example 1. A man, a horse, and a ship. So one of the most known correspondences have to do with the melotesic man or the zodiacal man. You know, very well known. You have hundreds of expressions of and images of this, you know, in art history it's well studied, in which there is an attempt to correlate each part of the body with a zodiac sign in order to ascertain medical conditions. So the existence of certain configurations in certain signs would signify problems within these parts of the body. Which then goes into further complexity when we talk about the tradition of the so-called Egyptian table, which then specifies that for each planet there's a specific body part depending on which sign they are. Beginning with their rulership and then following a planet in their rulership always corresponds to the head, and then you go along the zodiacal order. But this has been used as well in veterinary. So the same correspondence is transported to the animal case. And here we have an example, a figure of one of the editions of El Libro de Albateria, so a book on horse breeding, published in Spain, very famous, where you have an equivalent correspondence. With slight variations, sometimes because of the placement of the organs, but the principle is exactly the same. And the horse is the only example we know, and it appears in books, but I'm sure that a veterinary would, or the equivalent, the medieval equivalent of a veterinary, would do the same for other animals if needed. Of course, the horse was the equivalent to our car nowadays, so it would have a huge importance. It was a big asset. And that's why we have so many horrors on stolen horses, you know. It's very common. But there is another vehicle that was important and expresses also this structure, which is the ship. And so we have at least these three traditions of a melothesia, from man, the horse, and then the ship. And there are several variations of this. I'm not going into that in detail. I'll have a technical note, not the paper, technical note published with one of my colleagues, Juan Acevedo, in which we're exploring the different systems and how they shift. This is the early modern system, as we can find in books widely accessible, such as Lilith's, in which there is a sort of correspondence. We do have a pointer here.
It doesn't work on the actual screen.
Okay, no problem. So we have a correspondence where the front of the ship equates to the bow, equates to Aries, so the front part, the part between the bow and the water, so the neck of the ship would be Taurus, and then so on. Bottom would be the Cancer, the hold Virgo, which corresponds to the intestines, and then, for example, something that people find very interesting is the sailor's quarters, or the private parts of the ship, correspond to Scorpio, which would be the privates in a man's body. All of that. But, curiously enough, this system of correlations has a problem. Different opinions and textual transmission. So, if something fails along the transmission of this, we have a problem. So I'm going to give you exactly an example of that. So this is something I'll be publishing soon. This is several authors and the structure. So for Capricorn, since the Greek, and we have Demetrius, then we have Al-Rijal, they associate Capricorn with the rigging, so all the ropes and the rope structure that hold the mast and the sails. And that continues in a Spanish translation of Al-Rijal. However, when you translate, and Al-Rijal was translated from Arabic to Spanish and then to Latin. So there are two known translations, a Latin printed one and the Latin by Tedious. And Oviedo, and this is where the problem happens. So, sogas, which would mean ropes, which are funibus or cordis. In this one, the copyist made an error and put finibus, which is the ends, which is a slight variation of the word, and one letter, and we mess up. And so, this, which is the printed version that circulated from 1485 onwards, is going to be transmitted to the early modern as the ends of the ship, as we find, for example, in Lily. So the error perdured. While in other variations, we do have still the ropes and all of that. The same thing happens with Aquarius, where the mast, or the main sail, is then goes, instead of mast, it goes to magistro. Instead of malo et velis, magistro. So there's an abbreviation problem here. So it becomes the master or captain. So these are problems of transmission of these correspondences. And the fact is, although we see a wide usage of the zodiacal man and the zodiacal animal, this appears in books, but so far I haven't seen any example of this being used. Probably because there were some doubts on its transmission. So this is a problem of correlations. If we don't have a correct textual transmission, we might have a problem. Also, a problem that we find in this kind of example of the ship is that ships change. And so, things that were equivalent to, that exist in the structure of a Greek ship do no longer exist in earlier modern galleon or other big ships. So, that has to be rearranged. And those parts disappear. For example, it's the case of Gemini, which in the Greek tradition equates to these large wooden blocks that protect the oars of the ship, so that the oars could not be rammed and broken and immobilize the ship. And there are two at each side, like shoulder blades. So that was equivalent to Gemini, but that doesn't exist in later ships. So that is changed to the sides of the ship. So, but again, the same principle of correlation is here at play. And even astrologers, when they're not sure, they're trying to make the same correlation or an equivalent correlation as the form, the shape of the ship changes with time. Let's go to another example. Oh, no, yeah. A solution was devised to this problem. And this is the system that we see applied constantly, which is, instead of using signs, which we're not so sure, let's use the houses. Because houses are always the same and they simplify things. So, if we equate the angular houses, which are the most important of the chart, to the bow, the stern, the mast, and the bottom of the ship, then we have a general idea where the problem might occur. And this is the system we see used in examples of this practice, which is very little studied, but there are hundreds of charts where they're asking if the ship is coming, if it was okay, and if there was a problem, they're delayed, is there a problem, are they arriving, is the cargo okay? And this is usually the system of correspondence used. Go towards the simple. And that you know it works. Because we have to think that although we tend to perceive astrology in theoretical works, well, that's more than 90% of our data comes from theoretical works. It is a practical thing. You need to practice. You cannot be stuck on theoretical issues. If Pisces is the horse, or if it's the stern, you can't. So you devise systems in which you can use and make sure of what you're using. You create a correlation that works. And this is one of the houses. So the houses are going to assume this importance throughout the tradition. Let's go to another example. So let's party. So this is a lesser known example. It doesn't appear in many books, but it's quite interesting. Which is, if you go to a banquet, how is it going to be? Which is common occurrence, we always get invitations for banquets every week. So the system appears in Aben Rajel, in El Libro Completo, in the complete book on the judgment of the stars, but it's not his, it's earliest. I know there's an earlier version of this that I couldn't find in time for the conference, but I've seen it.
Maybe Hephaestus?
I think Hephaestus, yeah, it's one of the Greeks, in which you have a correspondence between the houses and the banquet. So if you ask how the banquet is going to be, the first house is, of course, you, the invitee, the beginning, and the quality of the food. So in general, is it going to be nice dinner or not so much? Then the person sitting on the left apparently is the second house, the servants, and the clothes you should wear. Then you have the third house, those attending to the food, brothers and friends of the host, the house itself, and the quality of the tablecloths. So that in which the food is set in. Then the fifth, you have the wine. Of course, you would have the wine in the fifth. Friends, children, grandchildren, and relatives of the host, and those bearing gifts. If they're bringing anything good, or it's just lousy, cheap gifts. Then the sixth is the person sitting on the right, and the servants. The host, and of course it's an Arabic version, so the wives and their relatives are also represented by the seventh house, and also those you meet during the journey to the banquet, which is quite an interesting thing. And then the eighth is the cellar and the cups where the wine is served. The attendants of the wives, the person sitting on the right, and the musicians. The ninth is the door of the house, so where you travel through. The kitchen staff and the caterers. Don't attempt to understand why, just go with it. The 10th is the lamps and prestigious guests. The 11th, those sitting by the lamps. I don't know what that means, don't ask. Friends and brothers, if they are loyal or not. And then middle class guests. The proper wife of the host, which I mean is the main wife, not the concubines or whatever setting, a cultural setting this is being made. If those of the house appreciate or envy the host. So all the drama and things going down the back, all the chit-chat of the host is done on the 12th. So again, what is being made here is you're picking on a reality, an event, you're trying to make correlations between that event and a celestial schema. And this is one of the things. This is more complex. If you read this, it's a huge chapter on the fifth house. And then it has the quality of the food, if the fish is going to be good, if the meat is going to be good or not, etc. It's complex. But this is the main idea. So we have here a system, a very interesting system of correlations for a banquet. So you know when you get an invitation, you know what to do. Now I bring something a little bit more interesting. Heaven or hell? What do I mean by this? This is part of the work of a colleague, Eleonora Andriani, who was kind enough to give me her translation of this to use here as a correlation. And this comes from Michael Scott. In his Liber Introductorios, he has several chapters on oraries, and so he has one like this. This is a preliminary translation. This is going to be published. This is being edited and published. And the chapter is entitled De Muertu si ibi ad paradisum vel ad inferno. So of the dead, if he's in paradise or he's going to hell. Which, if this was in the time of the Inquisition, which was not, you would have red sirens everywhere, red lights spinning and sirens going away. This is the most strange way of using astrology in a Christian context. So, he says something like this. When you have been asked whether someone who has died or been buried in ancient or recent times has gone to paradise or should still go, or to hell, see the ascendant and its lord for the person in question. where the ascendant altogether signifies the body and its lord signifies the soul. Afterwards, see the second house for the substance that the soul possesses in the received place. Afterwards, see the third one for companionship and their neighborhood, for the abundance or scarcity of goods, for many or few evils. The fourth one for the end of the whole and the stability of the place, and also the fourth house signifies hell. The 10th one signifies paradise. The 12th, the pit of the abyss. The 7th, the purgatory, and the 11th one, the atrium of paradise. The 6th, passion or tribulation in the place where he is. If the lord of the ascendant is well disposed in the 10th house, with the ruler of the 10th, or vice versa, say that the soul of the deceased is well placed and already gloriously received by God. And if the same planet is in a fortunate position or forms a good aspect, say this is even better. But if the lord of the ascendant is in the 12th house, which is the pit of the abyss, and the place of the darkness of the prison, despair, lamentation, mourning, and sadness, say that the soul of that person is already destined to hell. Lovely, isn't it? But if in the 6th house, say that they are in much tribulation or suffering. But if the lord of the 8th house, say that they are in hell. But if it is in the 7th house, say that they are in the hands of enemies and in suffering. But if it's in the 2nd house, say that they are in wealth and much consolation. But if it's in the 3rd house, say that they are in the company of close relatives and companions of love. But if it is the 5th house, say that they are in joy, but not in paradise. But if it is the 11th house, say that they are in the atrium of paradise. And so we should do if we want to ask this lovely question, which comes about to something like this. Mapping the afterlife in a chart. Paradise up above, hell in the 8th, the pit of the abyss, whatever that is, in the 12th, the gate of purgatory, sometimes also associated with the 7th, and all that. The only one where he does not have any information is the 9th. Nothing, at least in none of the versions that were explored yet. Probably because the 9th is the house of God.
Which is paradise.
Which would be paradise, we would suppose. Or nearby. At least it's nearby. So we will assume that it's not a bad place. But again, a very interesting and peculiar system of, and quite heretical, if we go very canonically by the church, a very heretical correlation and use of the afterlife, of Christian afterlife, in this context. So Michael Scott gave some very interesting materials. Okay, moving on. Now down to Earth. Now, these are examples of things that I have been researching or they're about to be published. So, one problem. One of the most important systems, if you want to do prediction in the early modern period, is the effects of lunations, eclipses, conjunctions, and a whole lot of possible configurations in Earth. So from antiquity, and here we have Ptolemy's system, but there are older ones, like Manilius, there is an equation between signs and regions, or countries, or people. And this astrological choreography informs how you practice mundane astrology, what we call nowadays mundane astrology, the revolutions, the eclipses, and all of that. But this is Ptolemy. By the time we get to the early modern period, which is my main area of expertise, we get to things like this. And this is one of the most complex, as I have seen, which come from a Peninsular author, Antonio de Najera, who writes a book on astrometeorology, and he gives this entire mapping of the early modern European world. Of course, like Ptolemy, we have a problem. Africa is just the Mediterranean, coast and the parts near Arabic Peninsula. And as we go further east, we have very little detail or information because we don't have access to that as much. So what happens when we start the global navigation process and we start reaching places where Europeans had never been before? Especially the case of the New World. What is going to happen when we get a whole new continent where no tradition practice has been before? Astrologers have no idea what to do. So it takes them a few decades, almost a century, to devise a possible explanation. And the first one to do it in print is Enrico Martinez, and this is in the Almanac of the Times and History and the Natural History of New Spain. So New Spain here being basically Mexico and a bit of the north of the South America, where he tries to solve that problem. And what he does is a very interesting exercise in astrological correlation. Because there's no precedent in tradition for this, he uses the Thema Mundi. And the Thema Mundi, which was very fashionable in these days because of the Greek authors and the interest in classical authors, is the basis for most of astrological symbolism. All the structure of rulerships, exaltations, signs, qualities, interrelationship of the aspects is somewhat codified in the idea of the Thema Mundi. So, he devises a solution. If Cancer is rising when the world was created, and he assumes, quoting several authors, that the world was created somewhere around the meridian of Damascus, then what sign would be rising in Mexico City? It's clever. Does it work? Well, not everyone thought it. So what he does is he makes a version of the Thema Mundi, and this was supposed to be animated, but unfortunately it was incompatible with the system here. And then he adapts it to Mexico City, where he finds that Capricorn is rising. So these new lands must be under the influence of the sign of Capricorn. And that perdures for a long time, until today. We'll still find books, well, not today, not so much, because this is not a practice that's done this way, but during the early modern period, in the mot of the 18th century, we have attributions of Capricorn to this region. Others come afterwards that sort of debate this. One, it's an hypothetical chart, so can we really do that kind of correlation? Well, might not be. And also, he got the mathematics wrong, because he didn't have the correct number of longitude, so Aquarius should be rising, not Capricorn. But in any case, what he does, which is also very clever, he tries to prove that Capricorn is really the sign of that land by the conjunctions of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars, Saturn, which every time they occur, they have affected the local people with all the diseases and nastiness brought by the Europeans, of course. But again, he proves by astrology that every time there is a conjunction in Capricorn, that area of the world suffers. Afterwards, this is being discussed by Diego de Cisneros, who opposes somewhat this idea. Antonio de la Calancha, which is an Augustine friar, gives out the whole choreography for the southern hemisphere, what we call nowadays Peru and all that region. He does all that region, maps everything, and then by 1665, we have this cosmograph Francisco Ruiz Lozano, who's already using these correlations as they are, normal everyday knowledge. So which means there's a discussion on which city is of which sign, which we don't see in print, but it's there. So they are establishing correlations. The only chart, foundational chart that I've seen so far is for the city of Lima, Peru, which is founded, so they have the time and the chart. Although that chart description is a little bit off, there was something there. Those dates don't fit very well. It's supposed to be Pisces, if you're curious. So we have all these correlations with the New World, and so we can establish a map. And this is all new information. This is going to be published very soon. And we see, for example, Chile and the coast of Chile being associated with Sagittarius, and the upper coast with Leo, but all this area in general with air signs, air triplicity. Capricorn to Brazil. Most of these don't have an explanation. Why? Amazonia, apparently Aquarius, which would think a big river, lots of water, perhaps, I don't know. But we also have then later on, this was the first area which is mapped, so Capricorn for the whole of Mexico, and earth signs for all the islands here, Barbados or Taurus, St. Kitts Virgo, Jamaica Capricorn. And this extends to North America, which for a long time Virginia is associated with Virgo. I wonder why. And then later on in the 18th century to Gemini, which is still a correlation discussed today. And we can still find in the works of some authors Cancer being given to New York, Philadelphia to Leo, and Charleston to Libra. Which means that this is being discussed and applied by local astrologers in their time. Sometimes it comes into print and we have the evidences of that. Sometimes we don't, unfortunately. And unless we find manuscripts, we won't know what they were doing. But again, here, the zodiacal system from above is being placed on Earth in a completely new system for the first time. A mapping of the new world, which has very little to do with foundational charts. Foundational charts only appear by the end of the 17th century. And here, in the New World, of course, you have several foundational charts because, the times for Europe, that would be impossible because that has been founded long, long ago, God knows who and why and when. But here you can do that. And it's when the New World is discovered that people start to look to foundational charts a bit more. Do they work well or not? Well, that's a problem. What exact point is the foundational point? Which is the critical moment? That's always the problem. But that's a problem throughout astrology. And for my final example, upgrading astrology. So this has to do with a mathematical movement that starts to be in science, in natural philosophy, by mid-15th century. Mathematics begins to gain weight as a form of proving the nature, proving things. And as this progresses, astrology is also going to be affected by it. And as also technical ability increases, we see astrology becoming more mathematical. And this mathematization of astrology also becomes a symbol of its perfection and its ability to correctly predict things. One of these systems, and for those who were in the conference in Batalha, they heard a little bit about this, but I have more news, so this is new. So one of the oldest mathematical ways of assessing planetary strength is in the dignity system, where domicile gets 5 points, exaltation 4, triplicity 3, term 2, phase 1, and then the exile and fall, which are the opposites of domicile, and exaltation 5 and 4 debility points. And this is well explained by Al-Biruni, which I think is one of the sources that really discusses this with detail, in which he says the dignities have a certain order of precedence. Most important is the lordship of the house, next exaltation, then term, then triplicity, lastly face, and so on. A certain scale of numbers has been assigned to them. That is, 5 to the house, 4 to the exaltation, 3 to term, 2 to triplicity, and 1 to face. The dignities of the various planets may therefore be added and compared with each other so as to see which is preeminent. And then he relates that an authority also gives a different system, 30 to lordship, 20 to exaltation, 10 to lordship of face, etc., etc. And then he says, but among the astrologers of the present day, the triplicity is regarded as having precedence over term and face, and indeed the latter is often considered of no account. Which means that the older system considers term more powerful, and then it's later switched with triplicity. But there are competing systems, or at least alternative systems. And this is a genre of literature that you find in astrological books. They usually say, this is all that exists. And then they emphasize the one that's either the most common and the most practiced, or the one they like. However, then we go to the matter of accidental dignities, which we have here. So accidental dignities, contrary to essential dignities, have to do with an accidental position of the planet. By accident, they are in that position at that time. It has nothing to do with the correlation to a sign. And among many, we have placement by house, angularity being the most important of them, relationship to the sun and the rays, combustion, Kazimi, oriental or accidental being the furthermost. Movement, direct, retrograde, fast, slow, latitude, north and south, often forgotten. Similarity, so IEs or contrariety of IEs. And there are several versions and variations of similarity, and others like Almogea, void of course, feral, aspects with the malefics, aspects with the benefics, etc. And in Schoner, Johannes Schoner publishes this table in his Opusculum Astrologicum, where for the first time in print we see this being weighed. So he gives this table of fortitudes and debilities of the planets, which is not the same as essential and accidental dignity, it's just the strengths of the planets, the fortitudes. And he gives a corresponding number of dignities or debilities to each of these conditions. And he says, before presenting the table, however, it should be noted that Don Antonio of Montulmi, in this thing of the strengths and debilities of the planet, distinguished by numbers. As for example, which is the case, the first and the 10th house obtain 5. That is the same strength of the planet in its domicile. And this is the key to the reasoning behind this table. He's equating that the planet in an angular house, the first or the 10th, is equivalent or has a certain equivalence or correlation to a planet in its own dignity. Because angularity is in the accidental dignities as strong or equivalently strong as a planet in its own domicile. That is the logic behind the system. And from that, this is devised. However, we have a problem. So, Johann Schoner publishes 3 major works. His Ephemeris in 1531, the Opusculum in 1539, and then the Judicis Nativitatum Liber 3, the 3 books on the judgments and nativities in 1545. In the Opusculum, he presents the table, but that table is not present in the Ephemeris, nor he discusses it in the judgments of nativities, which is odd. So, and because he's the first instance, we assume it's a new thing. But he says it's Montulmo, Antonio of Montulmo, that proposed that. Unfortunately, Antonio of Montulmo is very, very, very understudied, except when it comes to his 2 books on magic. He's a quite an expert on magic and talismans. That is quite well studied. There's an edition, at least of the Occultis et Manifestis, Liber Intelligentiarum, the book on intelligences. But we do have his Nativities, the book on Nativities, which is annotated by Regiomontanus. There's an edition of this in the early modern period, but it does not speak of this weighing system at all. I have yet to find a manuscript version that does, because sometimes these things are not copied. Not everything that's in print equates to what was in the original manuscript. We need to see the manuscript if it's still existing. Otherwise, we might get to the wrong conclusion. There's also this work, De Revolutionibus Annorum, which is a little manuscript, also owned by Regiomontanus, where we don't have that kind of thing at all. And I think there's only one copy of this one. Thankfully, it's digitized. So we have Antonius of Montulmo, and then Shona, who says he's getting that from Montulmo, but how? When? When is this devised? Because Montulmo is a medieval author, a late medieval author, so it's quite a long distance in time from one to the other. And we don't see any other medieval evidences of this being practiced elsewhere. So something is odd here. And there is a common point here, which is Regiomontanus, who annotates and owns most of the existing manuscripts by Montulmo. And in one of the manuscripts of Regiomontanus, we find this interesting little folio, where he has Antonio de Montulmi and then Fortitudinum Planetarum Debilitationis Planetarum, and has the whole list. Of course, as fate intends, these things are never easy, and at some point, someone decided to erase all the scoring. So the list is almost equivalent to what Shona is proposing, but we don't have the numbers. The few numbers that can be reconstructed by sort of enhancing the image correspond to what Shona says. So I think we can assume that it will be equivalent. And unfortunately, this library does not have imaging, infrared imaging that would allow us to reconstruct the erased numbers. But who knows? One day. Okay, I'm almost out of time. So we now have, here we are, so exaltatio, triplicitat, terminus facis, and gaudi, gradus, luni, gradus augmentatis fortuna. So we have all AIs spelled without an H. Applicatio cum infortuna, application to an unfortunate planet, etc. Peregrinatio, etc. Void of course, feral. So all the conditions are here. The listing is basically identical. There's just one or two differences. But now, and this is something that's also going to be published soon, we can have a chart this, because so Regiomontanus, of which Shona inherited the manuscripts, is the source of this. The question still remains, is this Regiomontanus' idea, or did he get it from some manuscript by Montulmo, which we have yet to find, or no longer exists? So that one I haven't answered yet. That requires funding and going to a lot of archives and libraries. But we do have this connection. And after Shona, the next great author to establish this connection is Cyprian Ljovic in 1557, who publishes this table. Again, and he is a wide-read author. It's one of those authors of the early modern period that almost no one knows about, but he's cited by every other authority after him, because he does a wonderful book where he not only explains the basic principles of the judgment of a nativity, but he does it by giving two examples. So everyone that really wants to learn astrology is going to have that book or a copy of it. And because he exposes this system more than Shona, it's going to be then copied and transmitted throughout the 16th century by Tasnier, Giuntini, Lindhout, and Origanos, who give versions or equal or similar versions of this system. And the system seems to be under discussion. So that neat table that we all know from Lilly, which is basically where everyone knows that from, it's not the only one. There are more variations of that table, which include things that others don't. So they need to be careful. Also, the concept of the scoring giving out a planet, which is the lord of the geniture, comes from Cyprian Leovitz. He's the first one to mention that concept. And he's also the one that devises the system to do an equivalent weighing of the part of fortune, which is also to be applied to the ascendant and the NC, which is something we don't see in later works. And we see numerous examples by the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th century of this, which one of the most known ones is this one by Galileo, in which he's using exactly this table to do the scoring of a chart. And much, much, much more could be said and exemplified, but this is what I want to say. We have to be attentive to how these processes of thinking, of reasoning, of correlating, of equating are not only explaining practices, informing practices, but creating new practices as new problems appear to be solved. So they're not coming out of their brilliant ideas that they had inspired by God knows what, but they are rooting this in an already existing system and trying to update the system to encompass new realities or new information. And thank you very much.